You need a proper Viking sword to make a Viking Scabbard, I would think, and my Reeve, although nice, was the closest thing that I had to anything Viking. But come on, let's be real. It's not the sword you want to be seen with in Valhalla. So I bought this Depika Hersir, this beauty from Viking Shield, unsharpened and thus heavy, but very inexpensive as well. Have you guys heard of Viking Shield? They sell a large variety of Viking replicas from armor, swords, shields, clothing, and are offering a discount to my viewers here at Matt's Great Hall. There's a link in the description for the discount. I have a couple of bronze chapes from Viking Shield. I have to tell you how pleased I was with the look and the quality. From ordering to delivery, they were great to work with, so I highly recommend Viking Shield. Today I have two scabbards to make, one for the Depika Hersir and one for the Reeve. The scabbard that I'm going to be making for the Hersir, I'm going to be giving away to someone for free, just for asking, but some more details about that later. Alright, we're going to get right into it and move quickly. First, I've traced the blade, and then I've added a line around the tracing, about 3/8 of an inch from the trace line. In the past, I've always used a jigsaw for cutting out the basic shape, but this time I'm going to be using a bandsaw for, hopefully, greater precision. The tools that I'm going to be using today, for the most part, are different from what I've used in the past. I'm taking a lot of your comments to heart. Comment I received suggested that jigsaws are best used as paperweights. So, we'll try something new. Speaking of new, in the past I've relied on this inexpensive block plane to smooth out edges, but you can really speed up your process with a belt sander, and I have one. So let's do it. Also, if you're wondering, the poplar scales are for the Reeve. I'm going to do the Hersir a little differently. Once you have the shape of the two sides and they match closely, it's time to carve out the inner portions to fit the blade. I've switched to these Swiss-made chisels. Previously I'd used little craft chisels, and they were super cheap, but they didn't stay sharp for very long, and they're really not very easy on the hands. For some reason, it seems like the greener poplar wood is a lot tougher to get through, so it's nice to have super sharp chisels. You can use a hammer or a mallet with these, of course, but I find they work pretty well just using a little elbow grease. Instead of hand sanding these scales, I'm going to use a Dremel with a sanding attachment. There's tons of sawdust, so a shop vac can keep things pretty tidy. Once there's enough room for the blade to rest between the two sides, it's already time to glue the two halves together. And less is best when it comes to glue. You really don't need a ton. And there you go. Pop a weight on it, not too heavy. I've made that mistake before. And now let's move over to the other scabbard core. I'll outline it the same way and make sure I account for the shape of the chape. If you plan to put a chape on your scabbard, you really need to make sure that you're shaping the wooden tip to fit it. I'd err on the side of leaving a little extra wood there, and then you can sand to fit it. Obviously, there's going to be a layer of leather between the wood and the chape, so start big. You can make it smaller with sanding. The Hersir came with this little piece of felt. Not sure what it's supposed to do. Maybe seal off the throat of the scabbard or protect the handle from moisture that would creep up under the guard, the cross guard where there's a space. Not really sure, but I'm going to lose it. I'm not really a big fan. Given the geometry of this unsharpened blade with virtually no distal taper, I'm going to use a router to cut it. And I know, it's like I'm doing everything that I hate to do. Power tools and now a router. But I think it just makes sense with this blade. Just testing it out here. It could be really precise with measurements, but I'm going to be winging it. Gluing the halves together is really no different than before. And here you can see the big cutout area. It's not the prettiest thing. One of the goals as we start to sand the core into shape is to make sure that the shape fits as well as possible. But that doesn't mean it has to fit perfectly. If it fits too much like a glove, you might find you have a difficult time of actually getting it on because, of course, the core of the scabbard is going to be covered in leather, and depending on how clean the stitching is at the bottom, you might find that the tip has become quite a bit bulkier. I'll show you more about what I mean when we get to the stitching part. Other things to keep in mind is that you need to be very careful where the two halves are joined. For both cores, I gave myself 3/8 of an inch, but really that's not very wide. If you get too aggressive with your sanding or you spend a fair amount of time sanding on the edges where the two halves meet, you might run into an issue where you actually create an opening, and obviously that's not something we'd want. It's just a preference, but I like my scabbard cores to come to a gentle point on the sides. I very much dislike the big bubble look of a rounded edge. For the core that I use the router on, this is a bit harder to accomplish because the sharper the edges get and the flatter your elliptical shape gets, the weaker the overall construction is. Once you get a shape you're happy with, it's time to seal it with some varnish. I'm using spar urethane, and the purpose is to waterproof the scabbard as well as to protect the leather from drying out. Wood has an amazing ability to absorb moisture from its surroundings. Probably the best brush would be an actual brush, but I've got a foam sponge instead today. I do about 2 or 3 coats of varnish, sanding in between with 220 grit sandpaper and then allowing them to dry overnight. Going back to, quick router cutout versus the slower, more difficult hand carving, besides the aesthetics and even besides the fit, the reason that I really don't like the idea of using the router is that the end result seems to have some obvious weak areas by the very nature of the design. Compare these two shapes. There may be a slight exaggeration here, but you can see where the one that was done with the router could lack strength. Vegetable tan leather is what we want to use. I just picked up this giant piece. This particular piece is 3 to 4 ounces, and I'll set it aside for a little bit. One of the ways that the scabbard will differ from the previous scabbard builds that I've done is the attachment of the belt or belt system with a wooden loop that will cut for it. How you want to embellish it is entirely up to you, but if you have a favorite scabbard maker, you could always search the internet for that person's work. Imitation is the highest form of flattery, so it's a good way to learn as well. I generally like it when there's lots going on underneath the leather, and vertical and horizontal lines are generally pleasing to me. I'm also going to cut out a couple of shapes that might provide a little more support to the wooden loop that I mentioned. The loop will sit about 4 inches in length, so we want to leave that space. And then I want these pieces to be really thick. So I'm going to use heavier leather. In fact, this is the leather I used for the soles of the shoes that I made. Put like an insert inside the shoe. And so this is really thick. I'm not sure the exact weight of the leather, but it's got to be around 10 or 11 ounces, I believe. I hope that's right. To shape it a little, the belt sander comes in handy. It's probably a better way to do that. I don't know, but the glue that seems to work well for me is Barge, all-purpose cement. It provides a good bond, and even over the varnish, it does really well. It's a little messy. I always start off wearing gloves and then end up throwing them away, but you should try to keep the stuff off your hands. But, easier said than done. I've always struggled with getting the leather to fit perfectly and neatly in the back where you lace it, and this is partly due to the fact that leather only becomes very supple when wet and then it shrinks as it dries. In the past, I've had edges pull away from each other, leaving this huge, unattractive gap, and there's basically nothing you can do besides painting the gap or actually starting over. But the sizing and the cutting and the sewing, it's all very time consuming. I think the best way to deal with this is to have a pattern. And I love patterns. Before I attempt to cut our vegetable tan leather to fit, I'm going to make a pattern with a piece of chrome tanned leather. This kind is usually already dyed, it's super supple, and it's used in a variety of textiles. It tends to be cheaper, and I believe this is due to the way in which it's processed. Apparently it's a very easy, quick process. I made my very first scabbard a while back out of a chrome tan piece of leather, before realizing that vegetable tanned is so much better. I'll trace the core and then trim as I go. The nice thing about patterns is that you can use them more than once, obviously, so you'll save quite a bit of time in the future if you need to make another scabbard for the same sword. It's a simple process to trace your pattern onto your vegetable tan leather and cut that piece out. And since we've got a much better handle on the fit than, honestly, any of the other scabbards I've made on camera, we can actually work the leather before we put it onto the core. It's a huge benefit. I'm going to punch holes at about 1 centimeter apart. Next, we're going to have to figure out our wooden loop, and I'll help you with a pattern for that as well. I think this is a good stopping place. So we're about halfway now. Oh, I mentioned that I'm going to be giving away the Topeka Herster scabbard, but it doesn't make sense to just send it to someone who doesn't already have the sword that'll fit the scabbard, right? So you've got to send me a picture of you holding the Herser. Something like this. You know what? I would even accept something like this. The email address is listed in the About section of YouTube. If you don't have the Herser, there's still time. There's a link in the description if you want to pick up the sword from VikingShield.com. So, first one wins, and I reserve the right to disqualify any fake photos. Thanks for watching today, guys.